Two patrols met in the mountains. One from the north, one from the south, both heavily armed, both exhausted, both absolutely not supposed to be there. For a long moment, no one moved. 20 soldiers stood facing 20 others across a narrow, winding mountain pass, rifles raised, fingers resting heavy on triggers. Safety catches clicked off in a terrifying wave of metallic snaps. One wrong movement could start a massacre. One twitch of a tired muscle could plunge two nations into a war neither could afford. Both commanders, separated by 40 meters of cracked asphalt and jagged rock, shouted the exact same order in two different languages. Hold your fire. And for a long, agonizing moment, it looked like the battle would never happen. It looked like discipline would win over fear. Then a single gunshot echoed through the valley, and everything fell apart. They called it the Serpent's Spine. The road through the mountains was barely wide enough for two civilian vehicles to pass, let alone military armor. On the left side, the mountain face climbed upward into a ceiling of heavy, gray clouds. On the right side, a sheer drop plunged hundreds of meters into a jagged, mist-filled gorge. It was the kind of place soldiers hated. Too narrow to maneuver, too exposed to hide. A perfect, inescapable kill zone for ambushes. Lieutenant Stefan Markovic led his patrol slowly up the winding path. 12 exhausted soldiers on foot, 2 armored personnel carriers grinding their gears behind them. Everyone was alert. Everyone was shivering. The cold up here wasn't just a temperature. It was an enemy. It seeped through their tactical gear, biting at their joints and making their fingers stiff. They had been patrolling the disputed border region for 6 hours. No sign of enemy activity. No radio chatter from command. Nothing. Which, to a veteran like Stefan, usually meant something terrible was about to happen. Stefan raised a clenched fist. Instantly, the convoy stopped. The heavy diesel engines of the APCs idled a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Something felt wrong. The mountain air was too quiet. No birds circling the updrafts. No wind whistling through the pines. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. Stefan's radio crackled in his earpiece. It was Corporal Dragon taking point 20 meters ahead. Lieutenant, movement ahead. Just past the bend. Stefan gestured for the squad to fan out, hugging the rock wall. He stepped forward carefully, his boots avoiding the loose gravel that could give away his position. He peered around the sharp, blind bend in the road. His stomach dropped instantly. The blood drained from his face, because there were soldiers coming from the opposite direction. Not Allied forces. Enemy soldiers, wearing the dark grey winter camouflage of the Southern Coalition. Both patrols froze. It was like a terrible, accidental mirror. 20 men staring at each other across 40 meters of cracked mountain road. Every single weapon was instantly raised. Assault rifles locked onto center mass. The heavy machine gunner atop Stefan's APC racked the bolt of his weapon. The metallic clack-clack sounding like a thunderclap in the quiet valley. In response, the opposing patrol's gunner did the same. There was no cover. There was no avenue of retreat. Just vertical rock walls and open air. Stefan slowly, deliberately raised his left hand, keeping his right hand firmly on the pistol grip of his rifle. Hold your fire. I said hold. Across the road, the opposing patrol leader, tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through his beard, shouted something similar in his own language. His voice was deep, echoing off the stone. For a moment, neither side moved. The tension was unbearable. It felt like the air itself had turned solid. Every soldier on that mountain knew the terrible truth of their situation. In a corridor this narrow, with this much firepower, if even one person fired a shot, no one would walk away. It would be a slaughter. Both sides would be wiped out in a storm of crossfire and ricochets. Stefan studied the other patrol. He looked at their eyes. They didn't look like hunters. They looked like prey. They looked just as surprised, just as tired, and just as terrified as his own unit. This wasn't a planned encounter. This wasn't a tactical interception. Both groups had been given bad coordinates. Both commands had screwed up. They had simply walked into the same deadly, narrow corridor at the exact same time, and now, one nervous finger, one slip on the icy road, could start a war that would burn the entire continent. The two patrol leaders stepped forward slowly. It was a deadly dance. Neither lowered their weapon, but neither raised them to their eye lines either. They walked with their rifles kept at the low ready. They stopped exactly in the middle, 20 meters apart, close enough to see the sweat freezing on each other's faces, far enough to have a split second to react if the other raised his barrel. Stefan spoke first. He kept his voice steady, projecting it over the idling engines. "We don't want to fight. You are in the northern sector." The other commander answered calmly, his accented voice carrying over the wind. "You are mistaken. This is the southern sector, and neither do we want to fight." Both men stood frozen, their eyes locked. Stefan looked past the commander, analyzing the terrain. He looked up at the cliffs overhead. Too many blind spots. Too many jagged edges where shrapnel would bounce. If fighting started here, the rock walls would turn the bullets into deadly, bouncing buzz. It would be pure chaos. "Let us pass," Stefan said firmly. "Back your vehicles down the mountain." The other commander shook his head slowly. "We cannot reverse the armor down a grade this steep without risking sliding off the edge. You back up. You are blocking our road." A tense, heavy silence followed. Both men knew the situation was a physical impossibility. The road was too narrow to turn around. The gradient was too steep to reverse safely. Only one patrol could yield, and whoever lowered their weapons first, whoever ordered their men to stand down and turn their backs, risked being shot in the back. Trust was a luxury neither man could afford. Behind the commanders, the soldiers watched nervously. It takes an incredible amount of physical strength to hold a heavy combat rifle completely steady for minutes on end. Muscles begin to burn. Forearms ache. Sweat rolled down faces despite the sub-zero mountain air. Rifles trembled slightly. Eyes darted frantically between targets, trying to predict who would shoot first. On Stefan's side, a young private named Luca Bailey, 19 years old. On his very first border deployment, whispered through clenched teeth to the veteran beside him, "Goran, this is how wars start, isn't it?" Goran, a man who had survived 3 separate border conflicts, didn't look away from the optics of his rifle. His voice was a low, steady gravel. "Not with orders, kid." Luca swallowed hard. "Then, with what?" "With accidents," Goran whispered back, with fear. "Keep your finger off the trigger, Luca. I mean it. Do not twitch." Asterisk, no one laughed, because they all knew he was absolutely right. Wars were rarely started by generals in comfortable rooms. They were started by terrified young men in the cold, jumping at shadows. Then it happened. A single gunshot cracked through the mountains. It wasn't a mistake. It was sharp. It was sudden. It was an unmistakable high-velocity crack that shattered the silence like a sledgehammer hitting glass. For a split second, a microscopic fraction of time, everyone froze. Even Stefan. His brain couldn't process the sound. Then, instinct took over. Panic overrode training. Chaos exploded. Both patrols opened fire instantly. The sound was deafening. 40 assault rifles, 2 heavy vehicle-mounted machine guns, all firing at once in an enclosed space. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, creating showers of lethal stone fragments and blinding sparks. Soldiers dove frantically for cover, throwing themselves behind the heavy tires of the APCs or pressing their bodies flat into the shallow, muddy ditches along the cliff edge. The narrow pass instantly filled with thick, choking white smoke and the deafening roar of war. The standoff was over. The battle had begun. The firefight was brutal, blind, and desperate. It was too close. The combatants were barely a stone's throw apart. It was too fast. There was no time to aim, only to suppress. Rifles barked in every direction. Tracer rounds painted the smoke with deadly streaks of red and green light. Stefan slid behind a massive fallen boulder on the left side of the road, slamming his back against the cold stone. He swung his rifle around the edge and returned fire in 3-round bursts. Through the chaos, he saw one of the enemy soldiers fall, clutching his shoulder. Another disappeared behind the heavy armor of the opposing vehicle. Explosions echoed like thunder as someone panicked and rolled a fragmentation grenade across the asphalt. The blast shook the ground, throwing dirt and shrapnel into the air, deafening everyone in a 10-meter radius. The narrow pass had turned into exactly what Stefan feared, a slaughterhouse. There was nowhere to retreat. The vehicles were blocking the path backward. There was no safe direction, just survival. Keep shooting so they can't shoot you. But through all the noise, through the adrenaline and the terror, one deeply confusing question burned in the back of Stefan's mind. Who fired first? He hadn't seen a muzzle flash from the enemy side. He hadn't heard one of his own men fire. The sound of that first shot, it had sounded strange, hollow, distant, between deafening bursts of gunfire. Stefan pressed his radio headset against his ear, screaming over the noise of the machine guns. Did anyone fire? Who discharged their weapon? The responses from his squad came back quickly, laced with panic and confusion. No, sir. Negative. Not us. It wasn't us. They shot first. They fired on us. Stefan peeked around the boulder. Through the smoke, he could see the opposing commander crouched behind his own vehicle. The man was holding a radio handset, shouting angrily to his men. Stefan couldn't hear the words over the gunfire, but the body language was universal. The man was furious. He was gesturing wildly at his own squad. The message was clear even without a translator. The enemy commander was asking the exact same question. Who fired the shot? Because neither leader had ordered it, and it seemed neither squad had initiated it. During a brief, terrifying pause in the fighting, a lull where both sides stopped to slam fresh magazines into their weapons, Stefan risked a glance upward. A piece of shale bounced off his helmet. Then another. He looked past the opposing patrol, past the smoke, high up the steep, jagged cliffside that boxed them in, and then he saw something that made his blood run completely cold. Movement, 50 meters above both patrols. hidden perfectly among the jagged grey rocks and stunted pine trees. A third group. They weren't wearing the uniforms of the North. They weren't wearing the colors of the South. They wore unmarked tactical gear, and they had rifles aimed directly down into the pass. Stefan watched in horror as a muzzle flashed from the rocks above. A split second later, a bullet sparked off the hood of his APC. They were the ones who fired the first shot. And now, they were firing again. Only this time, they weren't trying to start a fight. They were finishing it. Bullets began to rain down from the sky. But they weren't just shooting at Stefan's men. They were shooting at the Southern Patrol, too. Crossfire raining down on both sides of the road. Stefan didn't think. He just reacted. He dropped his rifle so it hung by its sling, cupped his hands around his mouth, and screamed across the pass with everything he had. Cease fire. Stop firing. Look up. The message barely carried through the chaos, but the sheer desperation in his voice made a few soldiers hesitate. The gunfire on the ground slowed for a fraction of a second. Then, more bullets struck from the cliffs. A Southern soldier was hit in the leg, collapsing with a scream. A Northern soldier's radio was shattered by a round from above. This time, everyone saw it. The muzzle flashes in the rocks overhead. The tracer rounds coming down at a steep angle. The third group had been waiting for the two rival patrols to meet in the narrowest part of the pass. Waiting for the standoff, waiting for the maximum moment of tension and confusion, waiting for one single shot to light the powder keg, and they had gotten exactly what they wanted. Now, two enemy patrols were slaughtering each other, doing the hard work for them, while the real attackers watched safely from above. Picking off the survivors, Stefan realized that if they stayed pinned down, fighting each other, they would all die. Both patrols, wiped out by an unknown enemy. He had to make a choice that went against every instinct, every rule of engagement, and every ounce of self-preservation. Stefan stood up. He stepped out from behind the heavy boulder, ignoring the bullets cracking through the air, ignoring the enemy rifles still pointed in his direction. He raised both of his hands, empty, into the air. Stop, he roared. Across the road, the opposing commander, the man with the scarred beard, saw. He saw the empty hands. He saw the bullets raining down around him. The commander made his own impossible choice. He stood up from behind the APC. He lowered his weapon and raised his left hand. Cease fire. The Southern commander bellowed to his men. The soldiers, confused, terrified, and operating on pure adrenaline, hesitated. But they saw their leaders. The ground gunfire sputtered, slowed, and finally stopped completely. The silence returned to the road, sudden and ringing, except for the sharp, rhythmic gunshots still echoing from the cliffs above. Stefan pointed frantically upward. They want us to kill each other. We are in a kill box. The other commander looked up, tracing the trajectory of the incoming fire. The realization hit his face instantly. The anger melted into tactical clarity. The ambush had been a masterpiece. To rival patrols, one narrow pass, one single shot, and total, self-inflicted destruction. The two commanders locked eyes across the 40 meters of bloodied asphalt. No words were needed. No peace treaties signed. No diplomats consulted. They had a common enemy, and they had exactly 10 seconds to react before they were all dead. Stefan gave a sharp nod. The Southern commander nodded back in unison. Both men turned their bodies away from each other, pivoting toward the towering cliffs. They raised their rifles, and they opened fire on the rocks above. Suddenly, the battlefield shifted entirely. Two opposing patrols, men who seconds ago were trying to blow each other apart, were now fighting side by side. Stefan screamed orders to his men. Shift, fire. 12 o'clock high. Suppressing fire on the ridge. The Southern commander echoed the exact same tactic. Gunners, traverse your turrets. Hit the tree line. The heavy machine guns on the opposing APCs roared to life, but this time they didn't aim down the road. They angled their heavy barrels upward. A devastating wall of lead tore into the rocks above. Trees splintered. Stones exploded into dust. The hidden attackers in the cliffs suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of combined fire from two fully equipped military units. They had expected confusion. They had expected panic. They had expected two blind dogs to tear each other to pieces. But they had not expected unity. The firefight shifted upward, completely turning the tide of the ambush. 40 rifles cracked toward the cliffside in disciplined, overlapping waves of fire. The heavy machine guns chewed through the rock cover where the ambushers hid. Luca, grenades. Stefan shouted. The young private, shaking but focused, unclipped a heavy, underbarrel grenade launcher. He angled it high and fired. A second later, an explosion rocked the upper ridge. The Southern patrol followed suit, firing rocket-propelled grenades into the high caves. The third group tried to return fire, but the volume of lead coming from the road was overwhelming. They were pinned down. They tried to retreat, but the narrow, steep terrain that had made the pass a perfect ambush site now trapped them on the ridge. They couldn't move without exposing themselves. Within 5 minutes, the return fire from the cliffs grew sporadic. Then it stopped entirely. The ambush collapsed. Those of the attackers who survived the barrage abandoned their positions, fleeing deep into the mountain wilderness, leaving their weapons behind, leaving the pass silent once again. The dust slowly settled. The thick smoke of cordite drifted away on the cold mountain wind. The two patrols stood quietly on opposite sides of the road. Weapons were slowly lowered. Slings were adjusted. No one spoke. The ringing in their ears was the only sound. Medics from both sides rushed forward, tending to the shrapnel wounds and the grazes. Miraculously, because of the heavy armor and the brief duration of the initial crossfire, no one on the ground had been killed. Minutes earlier, these men had been sworn enemies, ready to die for lines drawn on a map. Now, they had fought shoulder to shoulder to survive. All because of one gunshot. All because someone else had tried to pull their strings. Finally, the opposing commander stepped forward. He walked slowly across the center line of the road, stopping a few feet from Stefan. Up close, Stefan could see the exhaustion etched deep into the man's face. The commander looked at the bullet holes scarring Stefan's APC, then looked up at the blasted ridge. He looked back at Stefan and said one word: trick. Stefan exhaled a long breath, a cloud of white vapor in the freezing air. He nodded. Yes, they tried to use us to start a war. The Southern commander extended a thick, gloved hand. Stefan looked at it for a moment, then reached out and took it. A firm, brief, soldier's handshake. The commanders turned back to their respective patrols. Both sides slowly, definitively, lowered their rifles. Safeties were clicked back on. There was no victory here. No medals would be awarded. No celebration would be held. Just a heavy, shared understanding of how close they had all come to the abyss. "Mount up," Stefan ordered his men quietly. "We're going home." The southern vehicles carefully navigated the tight pass, inching past the northern troops. The patrols passed each other quietly on the mountain road. No one raised a weapon. No one shouted insults. No one even looked back. But every single soldier on that mountain would remember that exact moment for the rest of their lives. The moment when a single, manipulative gunshot almost turned confusion into a massacre. Wars often seem massive. They seem like unstoppable machines driven by politics, history, and grand strategies. Battles seem inevitable, written in the stars long before the first boot hits the ground. But sometimes, they don't begin with grand speeches or signed declarations. They begin with something incredibly small. One terrible mistake. One echoing sound. One single bullet. And sometimes, the only thing standing between peace and total destruction is the courage of one person to stand up, lower their weapon, and refuse to play the game. If you enjoy powerful, immersive military storytelling like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more intense war stories every week. And tell me in the comments down below, what would you have done in Lieutenant Stefan's situation? Would you have risked standing up in the crossfire to stop the fight, or would you have kept your head down? Because sometimes, the hardest battle a soldier will ever fight isn't against the enemy across the road. It's knowing when not to pull the trigger.